Karen stormed toward my driveway, phone in hand, screaming that I was turning the neighborhood into a war zone. She had no idea those vehicles weren't just relics, they were part of my history. And when the police showed up, what they did next left her frozen in place. It started on a sunny Saturday morning, the kind of peaceful day you look forward to after a long week. Birds were chirping, kids were riding bikes, and the gentle hum of lawnmowers buzzed faintly in the distance. I was out front, polishing the hood of my restored Humvee, one of 5 military vehicles I've spent years bringing back to life. Each one tells a story, not just about the military, but about me, a retired Army veteran with over 20 years of service, honorably discharged and finally living a quiet civilian life. But peace never lasts long on this street, not with Karen 3 doors down. She first noticed the collection when I brought the deuce and a half out last month. It wasn't running then, I just had it towed in for restoration. Even covered in tarps and rust, it drew attention. I saw her from the corner of my eye, arms folded, lips pursed, staring at the truck like it had insulted her flower beds. I didn't think much of it. People stare at old military trucks all the time. They're not something you see every day, especially in a suburban cul-de-sac. But Karen wasn't just curious. She was offended. That morning, she walked straight up my driveway like she owned the concrete beneath her shoes. I kept wiping the hood, pretending I didn't notice. I knew the storm was coming, and I didn't want to give her a reason to escalate. But she didn't wait for one. "This isn't a junkyard," she said, her voice sharp and nasal. "You can't just dump military trucks here like it's a base." I looked up slowly, meeting her eyes. "They're legally registered, restored vehicles," I said. "Perfectly within code. You're scaring the neighborhood. Kids don't need to see war machines parked outside their windows." I wanted to respond with patience, but it's hard to stay calm when someone disrespects something that means so much to you. These weren't just vehicles. They were symbols of sacrifice, history, and pride, reminders of what I and many others have endured. "I served 22 years," I said firmly. "Those vehicles, they're part of that story." Karen didn't blink. She pulled out her phone and started dialing. "I'm calling the HOA and the police." That was the moment I knew things were about to spiral. She didn't understand. She didn't want to understand. To her, these machines were loud, ugly, and dangerous. To me, they were family. I stepped back, wiped my hands on a towel, and watched as she shouted into her phone. She was loud enough for neighbors to hear, and that was the point. She wanted an audience. She always did. But what she didn't expect was how the police would respond. I sat on my porch as 2 patrol cars pulled in 15 minutes later. Karen ran to them like she was reporting a robbery, waving her arms, practically foaming at the mouth. "That man has military vehicles on his driveway. He's turning this place into a war zone." The officers exchanged glances, then one approached me. He looked at the vehicles, then back at me. "These yours?" he asked. I nodded. "Restorations. Registered. I'm a veteran." He paused, then raised his hand in a salute. "Thank you for your service, sir." I stood, returned the salute, and for a brief second, everything went quiet. Karen's face drained of color. Her jaw tensed. She looked back and forth between me and the officers, confused, even betrayed. "This can't be legal," she shouted. The officer turned to her. "Ma'am, he's not breaking any laws. Everything checks out. But this is a neighborhood. These vehicles don't belong here. They belong to a man who served this country, and he has every right to park them on his property. You may not like it, but that's not illegal." Karen stood frozen. Her phone hung at her side, her mouth half open. For the first time, she didn't have a comeback. And that was just the beginning. The officers eventually left, apologizing for the disturbance and thanking me once again for my service. Karen stormed back to her house, slamming her door so hard the neighbors' wind chimes rattled. I thought that would be the end of it. It wasn't. The next morning, I stepped out to grab the newspaper, and there it was, an envelope taped to my mailbox. Inside was a printed letter from the Homeowners Association. It was brief but stern. A formal complaint had been filed against me for visual disruption and inappropriate vehicle storage. The language was vague, but the message was clear. Karen had wasted no time escalating her complaint, and she had no intention of letting go. I wasn't surprised. People like her never stop at one strike. Still, I wasn't rattled. I lived through worse than an angry neighbor and some paperwork. I took photos of the letter, printed copies of my vehicle registrations, and highlighted the HOA's own bylaws, none of which restricted legally registered, operational vehicles, even military ones, as long as they weren't abandoned or blocking the street. I made my way to the HOA office that afternoon. It was a small building at the end of the block, and the moment I stepped in, the woman behind the desk gave me a strange smile. She'd been expecting me. "You're here about the complaint," she said. I nodded. She pulled up a file on her computer and glanced at it. "We've received several messages from a resident. She's concerned about the nature of the vehicles." I handed her my paperwork. "All legal. All registered. No violations." She scanned the documents, nodding slowly. "Looks like you're in full compliance. So we're done." Well, she hesitated. She's requested a board review. She wants the HOA to reconsider what should be allowed based on community standards. I chuckled softly. So she wants the rules changed because she doesn't like how they look. She's very persistent. That I knew. Over the next week, things got strange. I'd find small notes left on my windshield. Not handwritten typed. Anonymous. Words like eyesore, dangerous, and you don't belong here typed in bold. I'd seen this kind of behavior before, not in neighborhoods, but in deployments in conflict zones when tensions simmer just under the surface. Cowardice, masked in passive threats. I installed cameras on my property. Not for paranoia, but precaution. I wasn't going to let anyone mess with what I'd built. I'd spent years bringing those vehicles back from the brink. Long nights in the garage, sourcing rare parts, scrubbing rust from old bolts. Each one represented something I'd survived. The Jeep? That one mirrored the one I drove on convoy in Afghanistan. The Humvee? Same model we used during flood rescues in the Midwest. Even the Deuce and a Half reminded me of hauling supplies through back roads in Kosovo. They weren't just machines. They were pieces of memory. And I wasn't about to let Karen erase them out of sight and out of mind. Then came the day of the board meeting. It was held in the community center. Rows of folding chairs. A makeshift podium. About 30 residents turned up, more than usual. Karen arrived early, her outfit pristine, her expression rehearsed. She sat front row with a folder thick with printed photos, all taken of my driveway, zoomed in, framed just right to make the trucks look menacing. When it was her turn to speak, she wasted no time. "This is not a military base," she said loudly. "We are a peaceful, family-oriented neighborhood. These vehicles are frightening. They set a tone of aggression. They're not decorative. They're weapons." She even waved around a picture of the Humvee, like it was a mugshot. I didn't flinch. When my turn came, I walked calmly to the front and laid out my case. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't insult anyone. I just told the truth. These vehicles are fully legal, fully registered, and restored with care and pride. I'm a retired U.S. Army veteran. These aren't just part steel. They're part of who I am. There was a long silence after I finished. A few people nodded. One man in the back clapped quietly before stopping when Karen glared at him. The board promised to review the matter. As I stepped outside after the meeting, Karen brushed past me, muttering something under her breath. I didn't respond, but deep down, I knew this wasn't over. It was about to get personal. The night after the HOA meeting, I sat in my garage with the door cracked open. The hum of crickets filled the air, and the smell of old oil mixed with the faint breeze. I was working on rewiring the lights on my vintage military Jeep, the one with the olive green paint and canvas roof. I'd nearly finished when a sharp sound echoed through the stillness. A rock bounced off the hood of my Humvee. I stood up fast, heart pounding, not from fear, but from instinct. I scanned the street but saw nothing. No car, no movement. Just shadows and silence. The next morning, I found a rock in the grass, and beside it, another anonymous typed note. "This doesn't belong here. You don't belong here." It had escalated. Up until now, it had been words and complaints. Passive. Annoying. But this was something else. A direct message. Cowardly, of course, but deliberate. Someone had crept up in the dark, close enough to throw something at a vehicle I had spent hundreds of hours restoring. It wasn't just about the trucks anymore. It was about control. About intimidation, I filed a report with the local police. The officer who came out was respectful. Same one who had saluted me a few weeks earlier. "Keep those cameras rolling," he said. "You've got every right to be here. Don't let someone try to scare you into hiding." I didn't intend to. That weekend, I decided to do something I hadn't done since leaving active duty. I rolled all the vehicles out onto the street, lined them up along the curb, clean and polished. Jeep first, then the Humvee, then the troop carrier and supply truck. Each one spotless, American flag decals freshly placed on the bumpers. I spent the entire morning prepping the display. I even brought out my folding chair, sat on the edge of the driveway with a cup of coffee, and waited. It didn't take long. Karen stepped outside mid-morning. The moment she saw the street lined with my military vehicles, her whole body stiffened. She stood on her porch, jaw tight, eyes scanning every detail. I knew what she was thinking, that I was doing this to provoke her. I wasn't. I was doing it to reclaim the space she thought she controlled. By noon, neighbors began trickling out. Some walked dogs, others slowed their cars. One elderly couple stopped to admire the Jeep, and I gave them a little tour. Turns out the man had served in Korea. We talked for half an hour. Then came a family with 2 kids. The boys were wide-eyed as they peered into the Humvee's open doors. I lifted the younger one up so he could sit inside and pretend to drive. His mother smiled and thanked me. His dad, quiet at first, shook my hand firmly. Karen watched it all from behind her curtains. Later that day, I received an email from the HOA board. The vote had failed. Karen's proposal to ban military-themed vehicles was rejected. The bylaws would remain unchanged. It should have ended there. But that same evening, something worse happened. I came home from the grocery store and found the Jeep's front tire slashed. Clean cut. Intentional. Not wear and tear. Not an accident. It had been done with a blade. No cameras had caught it. Whoever did it knew where the blind spots were. I didn't feel angry. I felt resolved. This was no longer just about a complaint. It had turned into a campaign, someone trying to erase a part of me from this neighborhood, trying to scare me into silence. But I hadn't survived deployments across 3 continents to be driven out by a neighbor with a grudge. I replaced the tire. And the next morning, I made calls. To the local Veterans Association. To a few buddies I served with. To a retired colonel who ran a nonprofit supporting vets who restored military gear. The plan was already forming. If Karen wanted attention, she was going to get it. But not the kind she expected. A week later, the rumble of engines echoed down the street before sunrise. One by one, they rolled in Humvees, deuce-and-a-halfs, vintage Jeeps, even a restored troop carrier painted in olive drab. All fully legal, all pristine, and every single one driven by someone who had worn the uniform. I stood at the curb, coffee in hand, as my brothers and sisters in arms pulled into the neighborhood, parking up and down the block. A few of them I hadn't seen in years. We embraced like no time had passed at all. We didn't come to protest. We came to honor something real. By 9 a.m., the quiet suburban street had transformed into something powerful. It wasn't loud or chaotic. It wasn't aggressive. It was calm, proud. We'd arranged each vehicle with space to walk between them. Flags were mounted. Photos of each vehicle's history displayed on small easels beside them. It was a mobile museum of American service, right in the middle of a neighborhood where someone had tried to erase it. I didn't knock on doors or hand out flyers. I didn't need to. Word spread faster than any announcement ever could. By mid-morning, people started showing up. First, it was neighbors, curious, cautious, a few unsure what to make of it. Then came more parents with children, teenagers with cameras, even a local history teacher who asked if she could bring her students by later in the week. Karen didn't leave her house, but she watched. That much I knew. I saw her through the blinds, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the rows of military green. She wasn't yelling now. She wasn't calling anyone. She was silent, locked in the windows she once ruled through. Then something unexpected happened. An elderly man in a wheelchair, pushed by his daughter, rolled up to my Jeep. He wore a faded army cap with his division patch still stitched on the front. I stepped forward and greeted him. His grip was weak, but determined. I haven't seen one of these since '68, he said. We talked for a long while. He told stories I'd never read in any book. He'd been stationed overseas, watched friends fall, and somehow made it back with both wounds and wisdom. When his daughter wheeled him away, he turned and saluted. I returned it, holding it just a second longer than usual. That's when a local news van showed up. Apparently, someone had tipped them off. The reporter stepped out, glanced around, and approached me. I hear this all started because someone didn't like your driveway. I nodded. That's about right. She asked for an interview. I kept it simple. No insults. No politics. Just facts. I served this country for over 2 decades. These vehicles represent history, sacrifice, and survival. Someone tried to say they didn't belong here, but they do. Just like the people who drove them. The story aired that night. Karen's house was in the background of almost every shot. Her windows shut, curtains drawn, silent. That week, I received more letters than I'd ever expected. Some from neighbors who said they never knew I'd served. Others from veterans across the state, thanking me for standing firm. A local museum even asked if I considered donating one of my restorations for permanent display. I politely declined, because these vehicles belonged right where they were. I wish I could say that after the event, everything changed. That Karen apologized or softened. She didn't. Her silence wasn't surrender, it was retreat. But she never called the cops again, never filed another complaint, and the HO never brought up the issue again. Maybe she realized she'd picked the wrong fight. Or maybe, just maybe, she finally saw the bigger picture. I didn't create that gathering to prove a point. I created to remind people of what we stand on. The freedom to live without fear, to remember without shame, to restore what matters. And for the first time in weeks, my street finally felt like home again. It had been a month since the gathering, and the street had gone quiet again. Not the kind of silence that comes from tension or resentment, but the good kind. The peaceful kind. The kind I hadn't felt in years. The vehicles were still there, parked neatly in the driveway and garage, no longer drawing side glances or raised eyebrows. People waved now when they walked past. Some even slowed down to admire the details, the fresh paint, the care behind each bolt. I never set out to change the neighborhood. I just wanted to live in it fully, honestly, without hiding the parts of my life that mattered. I'd spent enough years on foreign soil, carrying the weight of uniforms and loss. When I came home, I promised myself I wouldn't shrink who I was for anyone. Not even for someone with too much time and a clipboard full of complaints. Then one afternoon, as I was tightening the side mirrors on the old Deuce and a Half, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned, and for the first time since it all began, Karen was standing on the edge of my driveway. She looked different. Not softer. Not exactly kinder. But different. Like someone who had finally run out of steam. Her arms were folded, but she wasn't clutching anything. Not her phone, not her camera, not her usual stack of papers. We stood there for a moment without saying anything. Then she spoke. I didn't know you were military. I nodded. You didn't ask. She looked at the truck behind me, then the Jeep further back in the garage. Her eyes stayed there for a long time. They remind me of my brother, she said suddenly. Vietnam. He never came home. Her voice didn't tremble. It didn't crack. But it carried weight. The kind you don't fake. I didn't respond right away. I just let the silence sit between us. She cleared her throat. I still think there a lot. But maybe I overreacted. I didn't offer forgiveness. I didn't offer judgment. Some things don't need either. Instead, I said, we all carry things differently. She gave the smallest nod, then turned and walked back to her house. I didn't expect more. I didn't need it. Some fights end with an apology. Others just stop. And that's enough. Later that week, the neighborhood held a small block party. Nothing formal. Just grills out, folding tables set up, kids running in the street. I parked the Humvee out front and left the doors open. A couple of the kids climbed in, laughing and pretending to drive. No one said a word against it. One of the dads came over with a beer and stood beside me, looking out over the crowd. She hasn't said a thing since, he said, glancing toward Karen's house. She doesn't need to, I replied. He raised his can in a quiet toast. You changed something here. I didn't know about that. But I knew what I hadn't done. I hadn't backed down. I hadn't hidden who I was to make someone else more comfortable. And now even the street seemed different. Not just because of the vehicles, but because of what they reminded people of. History, service, loss, pride. They weren't just mine anymore. They belonged to every eye that saw them and remembered someone of their own. I looked down at the patch stitched on my old jacket, faded, frayed at the edges, but still there, still holding, just like me.